Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel.
Now, let me ask you something that might shake you for a second. What if I told you that the United States of America, a country that for more than a century has been seen as the uncontested leader of the world, has just been overtaken? Yes, overtaken. Not in one small area, not in a single statistic buried in a report, but in a way so visible, so undeniable that the entire world is left in shock. And here's the twist. The country that has stepped ahead is none other than India. Pause for a second and let that thought sit in your mind. India, a country often portrayed as developing, often judged through stereotypes of poverty, chaos, and endless challenges, now standing taller than the USA on the global stage. How is that even possible? How did we get here? And most importantly, what does this mean for the world order as we know it? Today, we are going to dive deep into this transformation. India overtaking the USA, and by the end of this speech, I promise you'll not only understand the magnitude of what just happened, but you'll also realize why the world is so stunned, and why this might be just the beginning of an entirely new chapter in human history. Let's rewind a little. For decades, the United States has been considered the engine of the global economy, the powerhouse of innovation, the undisputed leader in military might, cultural influence, and technological dominance. From Silicon Valley to Wall Street, from Hollywood to the Pentagon, America's reach has been global. Every single nation measured itself against the USA, whether in admiration, competition, or resistance. And then there's India, a nation of 1.4 billion people. For much of the 20th century, India was known as a country struggling to lift its population out of poverty, fighting with bureaucracy, corruption, and uneven development. The story was always about potential. India could rise, India might rise, India should rise, but rarely was it framed as India has arrived. But history is not a straight line. The underdog doesn't stay the underdog forever. Somewhere in the last few decades, something fundamental began to change in India. Quietly at first, then louder. A technological boom, a demographic explosion, a cultural confidence, a strategic vision, piece by piece. India began rewriting its place in the world. Until today, we find ourselves facing this historic moment. India has overtaken the USA, and the world is shocked. Now, let's unpack what overtaking really means, because it's not just about one number. It's not just GDP. It's not just military spending. It's not just population size. It's the combined weight of influence, innovation, economy, diplomacy, culture, and resilience that has tilted the balance. And that is why the shock is so profound, because nobody expected all these pieces to align so powerfully, so quickly. Let's start with the economy. For years, analysts predicted that India would one day become the third largest economy in the world, behind the USA and China. But predictions have a funny way of being either too slow or too fast. India's economic growth rate has consistently outpaced not just the USA, but almost every other major nation. Driven by a young workforce, rapid urbanization, digital transformation, and a wave of entrepreneurship, India became the growth story of the decade. Multinational corporations shifted operations there, global investors poured in, and domestic companies scaled to international levels. At first, the USA didn't worry. After all, America had scale, innovation, and money. But slowly, the cracks started showing. While the US grappled with political divisions, rising debt, and slowing population growth, India was surging forward with an unstoppable demographic dividend. More than 65% of India's population is under 3.5. That's an army of workers, creators, consumers, and innovators. The engine of youth was powering India's growth in a way the aging Western economies couldn't match. Now picture this. In 1 year, India not only surpassed the USA in total GDP adjusted for purchasing power, but also became the world's largest hub for skilled digital labor. American tech companies, once the pinnacle of global supremacy, found themselves increasingly reliant on Indian talent, Indian markets, and Indian collaborations. That wasn't just economics, that was a seismic shift in dependency. But economy is just the beginning. Because with economic weight comes political power. And this is where the shock deepens. For decades, the U.S. shaped global institutions, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, the WTO, and influenced global policies to align with its national interests. India, by contrast, was often seen as a participant, sometimes even an outsider, never the one calling the shots. But as India's economic clout grew, so did its diplomatic influence. India became the voice of the global South, the bridge between East and West, the mediator in conflicts, the leader in climate negotiations, and the driver of international consensus. Countries that once looked to Washington for leadership began looking to New Delhi for guidance. This wasn't overnight. It was the result of decades of careful positioning, building alliances, and showing credibility. But when the moment came, the world realized that India wasn't just part of the conversation. India was leading the conversation. And then comes the cultural factor. Let's be honest. For years, America's soft power was unmatched. Hollywood, music, brands, social media. America defined global culture. But slowly, Bollywood, Indian music, Indian art, and especially Indian digital platforms began crossing borders. Indian food was already global, but now Indian creativity, storytelling, and digital content began capturing hearts worldwide. Combine that with the massive Indian diaspora, one of the most influential and widespread communities across the world, and suddenly, India wasn't just an economic powerhouse, it was a cultural phenomenon. So when we say India overtakes the USA, it's not just about numbers. It's about a larger story, a story of resilience, strategy, timing, and unstoppable momentum. But let's pause here, because I know what you're thinking. Surely the United States isn't finished. Surely America still has immense power. And you'd be right. The USA is still one of the strongest nations on earth. But the difference now is this. For the first time in over a century, America is not alone at the top. For the first time, the baton of global leadership is being passed not just to China, as everyone assumed, but to India. And that, my friends, is why the world is shocked. And the reactions? Oh, they are dramatic. Some countries are thrilled. Developing nations see India's rise as their own rise, as proof that the global order is no longer dominated by the West. Others, particularly those deeply tied to the US-led system, are nervous, even frightened, because the rules of the game are changing, and India is rewriting the playbook. In the coming chapters of this speech, we'll explore the exact steps that made this transformation possible, the struggles India faced along the way, the cracks that appeared in America's dominance, and the breathtaking moment when the world realized the balance had shifted. We'll dive into economics, technology, military power, geopolitics, and culture. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll see why this moment is not just about two countries, it's about the birth of a new world order. So buckle up, because we are only just getting started. But let's go deeper, because numbers and headlines alone don't tell the full story. When we say India has overtaken the USA, it's not just an economic ledger shift, it's an entire reordering of how power flows across the world. And nowhere is this more visible than in technology. For decades, Silicon Valley was the crown jewel of America. The iPhone, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, these weren't just companies, they were empires. Their influence reached every corner of the planet. But while the world marveled at American giants, a quiet revolution was taking place in India. What began as a hub for outsourced software coding grew into something much bigger, an ecosystem of innovation. Startups weren't just building apps, they were solving real problems at scale. Digital payments for hundreds of millions, healthcare platforms serving rural villages, renewable energy breakthroughs, and AI tools tailored for multilingual societies. The sheer scale of India's population turned every successful innovation into a global case study. UPI, India's digital payment system, processed more transactions than any platform in the USA, Europe, or even China. Affordable satellite launches by ISRO made space access cheaper than ever, forcing NASA and SpaceX to rethink their cost models. And Indian-developed AI systems, trained on the linguistic diversity of 22 official languages, suddenly became the benchmark for inclusivity in technology. The tipping point came when global corporations realized they weren't just setting up offices in India for cheap labor. They were moving R&D centers there, because India was leading in innovation itself. The phrase "made in India" stopped being a mark of low cost and became a mark of global first solutions. And when India started exporting not just software, but frameworks, platforms, and entire ecosystems, the world quietly shifted its gaze. America was no longer the automatic tech headquarters of humanity. India had joined the front row. Now, technology isn't just about gadgets. It feeds directly into geopolitics. Every leap in tech means leverage in diplomacy, security, and trade. This is where India began reshaping alliances. Historically, Washington used its tech dominance to secure partnerships and dependencies. But with India rising, nations of the global south saw a partner that understood their struggles and could offer affordable, scalable solutions without strings attached. Africa. Southeast Asia, Latin America, regions that often felt sidelined by American or Chinese dominance, began aligning with India. Suddenly, India wasn't just participating in forums like the G20, it was hosting them, shaping agendas and building alternative financial systems and trade corridors. The International Solar Alliance led by India became the backbone of renewable collaborations. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor rivaled China's Belt and Road Initiative. And when the global semiconductor race heated up, India positioned itself as the third major pole, not just a consumer, but a critical manufacturer and innovator. And then there's defense. For years, America's military superiority was unquestioned. The aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, nuclear submarines, the symbols of might. India, in contrast, had been seen as a regional power, focused largely on defending its borders. But while the US spread itself thin across endless conflicts and overseas commitments, India played the long game. Investments in indigenous defense technology, space-based security, and cyber warfare capabilities transformed its profile. When Indian-made fifth-generation fighter jets and hypersonic missiles rolled out, it wasn't just military news, it was a statement. India was no longer dependent on imports for survival, it was a defense exporter influencing global balance. But perhaps more surprising than military buildup was India's approach to security alliances. Unlike the US, which often led through dominance, India led through partnerships. The Quad with Japan, Australia and the US, strategic ties with Europe, defense collaborations with Israel and France, energy partnerships with the Gulf, and a delicate balancing act with Russia. Instead of building a network of dependency, India built a network of respect. Countries trusted India because it didn't come with the baggage of regime change or military interventions. And that trust became one of its strongest weapons. But let's take a moment to step away from raw power and talk about something more subtle. Societal transformation. For decades, critics pointed to India's challenges: poverty, inequality, infrastructure gaps. Those challenges didn't disappear overnight. But what shocked the world was India's ability to turn its weaknesses into fuel for innovation. Where the US struggled with healthcare costs spiraling out of control, India built scalable, low-cost health systems that the world began to copy. Where Western nations debated digital privacy and data sovereignty, India created frameworks like Aadhaar and data empowerment policies that redefined how citizens controlled their information. Even democracy itself took on a different flavor. America's democracy, once considered the gold standard, has in recent years been shaken by polarization, distrust in institutions, and political paralysis. India, while far from perfect, managed to run the largest democratic exercise in history repeatedly, with voter participation numbers America could only dream of. The spectacle of hundreds of millions voting peacefully became an image of resilience, a reminder that democracy didn't belong to the West alone. Now imagine the global reaction. For decades, the world order was built on a mental map, the USA at the top, others striving below. Suddenly, that map was torn apart. Financial markets reacted with awe and anxiety. Media outlets scrambled for narratives. Politicians recalibrated their speeches. Some celebrated the end of Western monopoly. Others feared the rise of a new rival power. And ordinary people, they were simply stunned that the headlines they'd grown up with, America the superpower, were no longer the default truth. And here lies the biggest shock. Nobody expected it to be India. For years, all predictions said if anyone would rival or surpass the US, it would be China. But China's rise came with suspicion, concerns about transparency, authoritarianism, debt diplomacy. India, by contrast, carried the weight of democracy, diversity, and soft power. That gave its rise a different legitimacy. Suddenly, the underdog story was not only believable, but inspiring. Now let's talk about America's reaction, because that's crucial. On one hand, Washington was stunned. Losing the #1 spot was never in the American playbook. For over a century, Americans had been raised with the idea that their country led the world by default. But reality cannot be ignored. And here's the irony. America had played a role in fueling India's rise by outsourcing, by educating Indian talent, by collaborating in tech. Many of the very tools that strengthened India had roots in America. The pupil had learned from the master and now surpassed him. Yet, it would be wrong to frame this as a rivalry in the old Cold War sense. Unlike the US-Soviet split, India's rise doesn't necessarily mean America's collapse. What it means is multipolarity, a world where power is shared, influence is diversified, and leadership is contested. That's a harder pill to swallow for Washington, but it's also an opportunity because cooperation between the US and India could reshape the world in ways no single nation could. But whether cooperation wins or rivalry hardens, one thing is undeniable. The myth of America's eternal dominance has been shattered. And this brings us to the final stretch of our journey together. Because the question we must all ask is this: what does the future look like in a world where India has overtaken the USA? The answer is both hopeful and daunting. Hopeful because India's rise brings representation to billions who never felt included in the global order. A world led in part by India may focus more on inclusivity, on sustainable development, on bridging inequality, but daunting because transitions of power are rarely smooth. History shows us that when one power rises and another adjusts, turbulence follows. Trade wars, cultural clashes, diplomatic tensions, all of these could intensify. And yet, as I close this speech, I want to leave you with a vision. For centuries, civilizations have risen and fallen. Rome, Britain, the USA. Each time the world shifted, and each time humanity continued its march forward. India overtaking the USA is not the end of one story, but the beginning of another. The story of a nation that transformed from colonization to poverty to leadership in less than a century. The story of a people whose diversity became their strength, whose struggles became their innovation, whose resilience became their power. The world is shocked. Yes, but maybe shock isn't the right word. Maybe the world is simply waking up to a truth that was always coming, that leadership is not a birthright of one nation, but a responsibility that can be earned by any nation willing to rise with vision, courage, and determination. And so as we stand in this historic moment, I say this: the rise of India does not diminish the USA, it expands the possibilities of the world. It shows us that history is alive, that change is real, and that the future belongs not to one power, but to all who dare to dream, build, and lead. India has overtaken the USA. The world is shocked, and the story is only just beginning.